Hi everyone, I'm John. It's Tuesday, and for as long as I can possibly make that happen, you know what that means, another book review. The book I would like to talk about today, I finished last week, and it is called Dangerous Games, The Uses and Abuses of History by Margaret MacMillan. Margaret MacMillan is actually a Canadian historian and has written several good books in the past, including two up there that are mentioned right below her name. Paris 1919 is about the composition of the Treaty of Versailles in France, which is of course the famous treaty that ended World War One. And I have right here on my bookshelf next to me the other one, Nixon and Mao, of course, about the famous meeting between the two guys who, in 1973 or 773, I think, that sort of started to de-thaw relationships between the relationship between the U.S. and China. So those are histories that have more sort of arcs to them. This is a series of discussions broken up into chapters, exactly about what you would think it sounds like. Just sort of discussions about history, not so much historical events themselves, even though she uses those to help illustrate what she's talking about. So whatever our relationship to history, whether we were forced to read it in school, I'm sure most of us were, or if we voluntarily read it today, or if we honestly and considerately reconcile ourselves to how important it is, we usually never get to the point where we try to understand the influence of historiography. MacMillan's book is mostly concerned with introducing the casual reader, and I'll come back to that later, what I mean by casual, to what could roughly be called as historiographical concerns or questions. Questions like, who owns the past? Or how do we shape this past in ways that makes ourselves more abiding or marginal parts of it? And perhaps most importantly, when we abuse that past either purposefully or accidentally, who suffers from it and how? Despite Margaret MacMillan's relatively liberal position on many of the at least contemporary historical examples that she uses, she does strike a more cautious, conservative tone when she suggests that history has, unfortunately for her, found itself to fall into the hands of amateurs, and also that history has been dethroned by academic sort of mishmash pursuits that go by names like cultural studies or African studies. I'm sure she, gender studies and things like that too, claiming that these are more specialized forms of victimhood than they are proper historical study. She seems to be operating under the fallacy that if it weren't for the pernicious tentacles of rank neophyte historians, then the precious reserve of history with a capital H would remain like a virgin, undeflowered, which is really funny and ironic considering the subject in question that's being raised in the book. But even setting aside the relative merits or demerits of certain trends in social science, no one can honestly look at the body of history written by professional historians and claim that their work is free of abuse, of free of self-serving conclusions, or other epiphenomenon of sloppy thinking. This kind of formal scholarly history that she favors in the book is very much studied with all of these things. being an academic and a historian herself, Margaret McCullough, Margaret MacMillan, might find it, I guess, natural to want to defend her profession as one of the last ramparts against sort of the barbarian hordes and the great unwashed masses coming in and deciding to pretend like they know enough to write large books of history on particular topics, when she has made a career out of this as a fully trained academic. The book has a more substantial problem, though, I think. For the most serious readers of history, I can't imagine someone that is sort of passingly interested in history picking up a book with this title. Maybe I'm wrong, let me know. The depth of the examples that she discusses doesn't really provide any lasting, fruitful insights on the subject matter. So, for example, in the chapter called History and Identity, which explores the many ways in which we make sense of ourselves through the refraction of historical experience, or to borrow her phrase, reinforcing an imagined community, which of course she herself borrows from Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities book. She mentions these things, these events, these topics: the legacy of lynching in the United States, the rise of the deaf rights movement, as in lack of hearing, DEAF, the 19th century Italian nationalist Mazzini, Karl Marx, the history of Vimy Ridge, which is an important place name in the creation of Canadian cultural identity, French-Canadian nationalism, the events of Tiananmen Square, and more. So this is a chapter that's maybe 20 or 30 pages, and she talks about all of those different subjects in that short span of time. Because of the jumpiness of the subject matter, she never really gets to explore anything but sort of a patina of the relationship, the very problematic relationship between history and how we build our own identities as people. Had she chosen one or two of these examples, she would have been able to fully flesh out an interesting and insightful argument. But as it stands, there are no new ideas that are going to open the eyes for most readers. It could be, however, that a very useful introduction into the world of how history is seen by theorists of the subject, as not just a list of objective facts and events and places, but rather a complex accretion disk of memory, wishful thinking, and the fact that history is ultimately the artistic reconstruction of minds who themselves are always inextricably caught within the nets of that history. For someone who is interested in the topic but might be interested in something a little more advanced, there is another writer who writes largely on the same thing, just at sort of another level. I would really recommend the work of the recently deceased, unfortunately he died earlier this year, historian, literary critic, historiographer, Hayden White. He wrote a book in the early 70s, I believe, called Meta-History: The Historical Imagination in 19th Century Europe, which is nothing short of canon-worthy. It's absolutely wonderful, and you see it on a lot of graduate school reading lists for graduate historians first going into school in courses like historiography and stuff like that. White's books of essays, including The Content of Form, Narrative Discourse, and Historical Interpretation, Tropics of Discourse, Essays in Cultural Criticism, and The Fiction of the Narrative, Essays on History, Literature, and Theory, 1957 to 2007, are usually just as difficult, but are delivered in more easily digested pieces, namely essays. While some of these might take the reader a little bit further afield than they're accustomed to, it is he is guilty of much of that sort of post 1965 1970 trends in social science that MacMillan herself is not such a huge fan of. Even though you might encounter quite a bit of that, I think the richness and relevance of White's conclusions are always thought-provoking and always fascinating, and they're especially germane to any social science, not just history. So if that sounds interesting to you and you're afraid of someone like Hayden White, I would go ahead and pick this up just to see the kinds of questions that historiography is kind of concerned with. And then if you're fascinated, go and pick up some Hayden White, because that's where the real gold mine is. But as an introduction, it's not altogether bad. Dangerous Games, The Uses and Abuses of History by Margaret MacMillan. See you next Tuesday, guys.